So as a father of two inquisitive young boys, I get questions all the time. For example, when we're driving in the car, and I get stopped at a red light, coming from the back seat, Connor asks, "Daddy, why stopping?" He thinks that when we're in the car, we should always be moving. So he always wants to know why we're stopping. And whenever the light turns green and we start moving, he says, "Go, Daddy, go, Daddy." He likes to go fast. So he doesn't like when we stop. But Landon's 5, and he has questions about everything. My grandmother died a few weeks ago, and of course he had questions about that. So we sat down and talked about that a little bit. But he asks questions about everything. He's asked questions about why there's a virus, why we can't do certain things because of the virus. When we're saying our night-night prayers at bedtime, he's asked questions about God. Where does God live? Why can't we see him? How can God live in heaven and in our heart at the same time? He asks questions, all kinds of different questions. Some of his questions aren't as profound, though. He asks, why do I have to go to bed and why do I have to go to school? But it's just constant questions. There are all kinds of questions. And today we're starting a short 2-week sermon series called Got Questions. A couple weeks ago I handed out these cards to you guys asking you to write down your questions about God, about the Bible, about faith, about life in general, and thankfully I got a pretty good response. I appreciate everyone who took the time to fill those out, to ask their question, and I got a wide range of questions. Some of them I kind of put together. I kind of categorized them into one overall encompassing question, which is kind of what happened with the question today. But there were some other questions that I didn't really feel kind of fit into a sermon, and they were more just factual questions. And so I think I've been thinking about maybe addressing those in our Sunday and Wednesday night Bible study. They kind of fit along the lines of our Acts study. They're more like church history type questions. So I think I might address some of those in that Bible study setting. But there were some really, really good questions that I'm going to address this week and next week. And some of those big questions we're going to answer today. But some people are shy about asking questions. They think that it kind of makes them look stupid if they don't know the answer. They don't want to ask a question because they don't want to appear to not know something. I don't think that anyone should feel stupid for not knowing anything, for not knowing something, or for asking a question about something that they don't know. There's only one who knows everything, right? And that's God. For the rest of us, there is an unlimited amount of things that we do not know. There are lots and lots of things that we can learn that we don't know yet, and it requires us to ask questions to find out those answers. There's a saying that you learn something new every day, right? And that's absolutely true. And not only should we continually be learning and studying and asking questions and finding out new information every day, there's also things that we cannot know until a new day comes along. Now, there are things about the future. There's knowledge and information that we just do not currently have access to. And every single day unlocks access to that information. Let me give you an example. None of us know what the temperature is going to be tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We cannot know that because it's in the future, right? We can consult our phones. Maybe we can go to a website that has the hourly forecast predicted for tomorrow. There are people who make guesses at what the temperature is going to be at any point during the day. But we will not definitively know the exact temperature until 3 o'clock rolls around tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we can check a temperature gauge. We can ask Siri on our phone, whatever it may be, to find the exact temperature of what the exact temperature is at an exact point in time. But until that time actually comes, we can only make guesses about what that temperature will be. There is no shame in asking questions. In fact, asking questions reveals certain things about your character. It reveals that you are eager to learn. It reveals that you're humble enough to admit your own ignorance. It reveals that you have the courage and the energy and the will to do what it takes to understand things that you don't yet. Learning is a lifelong process. We will never stop learning. I don't even think that at the end of our life, the learning process will end. For those of us who have put our faith in Jesus, we will live for eternity with God in heaven. And I believe that even in heaven, we will still be continually learning. The reason that I believe this is that we will never be omniscient, because we can never become like God in that way. Only God is omniscient. We can never get to a point, we will never get to a point, where we know everything in the same way God does. God is omniscient. That means that He knows everything. The reason that God is because He is maximally great in all things. If there was another being or another entity that knew everything the way God knows everything, then that being or entity would be equivalent with God. So there is no other being that can be omniscient like God, because there is only one God. God is God because He is maximally great in all things. And so in His omniscience, He is maximally great. He is able to know the maximum amount of knowledge that there is to know. We are not God, and so we will always be continually learning. And in order to learn, that means we have to ask questions. And so that brings us to the first question that we're going to discuss today. Did God predetermine all of human history? Like I said, I received quite a few different questions. This is kind of an amalgamation of some of the questions that I received. Some people asked about predestination. There were some people that asked about free will. So I kind of came up with this question myself to kind of encompass all of those questions that were turned in. And so the question we're going to talk about today is, did God predetermine human history? This question is one that is heavily debated among Christians today. In fact, it may be the one question that is the most heavily debated among Christians today. This question is a difficult one to answer. This question requires a deep theological answer. I was thinking this week that I should probably have changed the title of this sermon series to "You Asked For It," because you turned in the questions, and so these are the ones that I'm going to answer. But it's a deep, deep question. Did God predetermine all of human history? There are some people that argue that God did not predetermine all of human history because He gave people free will. Others argue that God did not give people free will, and that He did, in fact, predetermine all of human history. And so, who's right? That's what we're going to attempt to find out this morning. So strap on your thinking caps, because this is going to be very deep, very, hopefully everyone will be able to follow. There's times I get confused myself, even when I'm talking about this. So hopefully we can get through this and have a better understanding of who God is and how He has created the world and how He works and interacts with the world. But the debate about predestination, about whether or not God predetermined everything from creation, centers around three different aspects of God's nature. One we've already talked about a little bit, His omniscience, how He knows everything. The second aspect of His nature that is involved in this question is His sovereignty, which is about His control, His authority over creation, how He controls it. And the third aspect of his nature that is involved in this question is his goodness. So these three parts of his nature we're going to walk through here to try to attempt to answer this question. Did God predetermine all of human history? Those three aspects again of his nature: his omniscience, his sovereignty, and his goodness. And so let's talk a little bit more about his omniscience. What does it mean that God is omniscient? We already said that it means that he knows everything, but sometimes it's a little bit difficult for us to comprehend exactly what that means. What does it mean that he knows everything? What is he able to know? It's difficult for us to grasp exactly what it means by the maximum amount of knowledge. If God is maximally great in his omniscience, that means that he possesses the maximum amount of knowledge that there is to know. God being omniscient means that he knows everything that can possibly be known. All things that can be known, God knows. Even things that we cannot know, if it's possible to know it all, he knows it. It's impossible for us to know the exact temperature of what it will be at 3 o'clock tomorrow. That is impossible for us to know. But it is possible to be known. And so because it's possible to be known, God knows it. God can know, and so he does. It is possible for God to know what is going to happen in the future. And so he knows the future. He knows the temperature, what the temperature is going to be, not only tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but he knows what the temperature is going to be on every day for the rest of human history. It's possible for God to know everything that happened in the past. And so he knows what the temperature was yesterday. I can look it up. I don't know what the temperature was at 3 o'clock yesterday, but I could look it up. It is a fact of human history that it was a particular temperature at 3 o'clock. I don't know what it is, but God knows, right? He not only knows what the temperature was at 3 o'clock yesterday, but he knows the temperature of every day going all the way back to creation. And so we can actually divide God's knowledge, what he knows, into two categories. His knowledge of the past and his knowledge of the future. His knowledge of the past, let's talk about that for a minute. It can also be divided into two categories. It can be divided into facts, and it can be divided or categorized as counterfactuals. Let me explain that a little bit. Facts. God knows every fact about everything that has ever occurred and everything that has ever existed in all of human history. Everything that has actually occurred and everything that has actually existed in creation for all of human history, God knows it. Jesus actually affirmed this. This is what he said at Luke chapter 12, verse 7. Indeed, the very hairs on your head are all numbered. God knows every fact about human history down to the number of hairs on your head. For some of us, that number gets smaller every day. But God knows exactly how many hairs are on each one of your heads. He knows every fact about everything that has ever happened, that has ever occurred in all of human history, in all of the past. Not only does he know every fact, everything that actually happened, he also knows every counterfactual. So a counterfactual is something that is counter to fact. Something that could have occurred in the past, but didn't. Again, I'm going to use the temperature example. There is only one fact about the temperature at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Let's say hypothetically, for the sake of argument, it was 80 degrees yesterday at 3 o'clock. I didn't look it up. I didn't check, so I don't know for a fact it was 80 degrees, but let's just say it was. There is only one fact of human history about the temperature yesterday at 3 o'clock. It was 80 degrees. 80 degrees at 3 o'clock, September 4th, 2021. That would have been a fact of the past. However, there are many counterfactuals. Things that could have been true, but turned out not to be true. It could have been 79 degrees at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. It could have been 78 degrees, could have been 77 degrees, could have been 81 degrees. All of those were counterfactual because they could have been true, but they didn't turn out to be true because it was actually 80 degrees. Is everybody tracking with me? I told you it was going to be a tough one today. Every single counterfactual that could ever have occurred throughout human history are different timelines of human history. They're different worlds. They're different worlds that could have possibly existed. Different timelines of human history that could have existed but didn't. Those are counterfactual timelines. Those are worlds and timelines that we could be living in right now, but we don't because those things did not actually happen. The reason that we live in this world, this timeline that we live in right now, is because of all the things that actually happened throughout human history that have led up to this one point. For example, we could be possibly living today in a world where it was 79 degrees yesterday at 3 o'clock. But instead, again, this is a hypothetical situation, instead we live in a world where it was 80 degrees yesterday at 3 o'clock. And so if someone were to come up to you and ask you the question, hey, what was the temperature yesterday at 3 o'clock? In this world, you would say it was 80 degrees. But in a counterfactual world, you might have said it was 79 degrees, depending on what actually happened. The consequences or the differences in these timelines of the ones that actually happen and the ones that turn out not to happen, the differences of those timelines, they probably would not be affected much based on 1 degree here or there, right? That's not really going to impact human history that much. However, there are major events in human history. There are major decisions that we make every single day that have a huge impact on the course of human history, on whether history goes this way or whether history goes this way. Decisions that we make every day determine the course of human history, whether things actually happen or whether they don't turn out to happen. The decisions that we make every single day are what creates the timeline that we live in. It creates historical fact. The things that we decide not to do, those create alternate timelines that could have existed but didn't. God knows not only the human history that actually happens, He knows every other alternate timeline that could have existed. That is His omniscience. He knows everything. God is able to know every possible world, every possible timeline that could ever have possibly existed, based on every single choice, every single action that every single person who's ever lived has ever made. A seemingly infinite number of possible worlds, possible timelines, based on the innumerous counterfactuals of everything that has ever happened in all of human history. The example of the temperature, like I said, probably would not have made a huge difference in the course of human history. But something like D-Day, the beaches getting stormed, the beaches of Normandy getting stormed by American troops in World War II, that was a major event in human history. We don't know what would have happened today if the beaches of Normandy were stormed on June 7th, 1944, instead of June 6th. We don't know what the timeline of human history would have been if the beaches were stormed on June 5th instead of June 6th. If the Americans had landed on Normandy one day earlier or one day later, it could have changed the entire course of the war. It could have changed the entire course of history as we know it. Or maybe it wouldn't have made much of a difference at all. I don't know. I'm not God. But we can imagine how it could have changed human history, how it could have affected the way we live our lives even today. But God knows what the timeline would have looked like. He knows what our lives would look like today if D-Day was on a different day. That is God's knowledge of the past. Everybody still with me? Hopefully I'm not blowing anybody's mind here, but it's a deep, deep subject, trying to contemplate the mind of God. The difference between our knowledge and God's knowledge of the past is that we can know some facts. All of us know some facts, but God knows all facts. We can say that maybe this or that would have happened. We can kind of guess about counterfactuals, how they would have affected history. But God knows every counterfactual. He knows exactly what would have happened if different actions were taken, if different decisions were made. He knows exactly how it would all happen if it happened differently. That's his omniscience. Not only does God have infinite knowledge of the past, he also has infinite knowledge of the future. There are two types of knowledge, two types of things that will happen in the future. Certainties and possibilities. Certainties are things that will absolutely occur in the future. Possibilities are things that may or may not occur in the future. The only thing that we can know about the future are possibilities. It's possible that this or that may or may not occur. That's all that we can know. That's all we're able to know. Even things that most people would maybe consider a certainty are in reality only possibilities. Most people, for instance, might say that the sun is definitely, certainly going to rise tomorrow. Even though there is an extremely high probability that it will, it's still possible that it won't. We can only know possibilities. With God, however, everything about the future is a certainty. Even though there are possibilities from our perspective, he knows with certainty what will occur and what won't occur. So let me give you a biblical example of how this kind of plays out. At 1 Samuel chapter 23, David was in hiding from King Saul. Saul wanted to kill him, and David fled, and he was in hiding. David was told by some of his scouts that the Philistines were in a town called Keilah. And they were attacking this town, and David made the decision that he wanted to go to Keilah to attack the Philistines. But first he consulted God. He asked God whether or not God wanted him to go to this town, Keilah, and fight the Philistines. And God told him that he should. So David took his men, went to the town of Keilah, and he fought off the Philistines. And David and his men took refuge within the city walls of this town called Keilah. When David was in Keilah, King Saul received word that David was there. And so Saul gathered up his army and headed for Keilah. David found out that Saul was coming to this town, Keilah, to capture him and probably kill him. And so again, David prayed. David prayed to God to ask him whether he should stay in Keilah or whether he should leave Keilah. He had this decision to make of whether to stay or to leave. And in either situation, one of two things could have occurred. The people of Keilah might have protected him if he stayed, or the people of Keilah might have handed him over to Saul. If he left, he could have fled and got away and been safe from Saul. Or if he left the city walls, it may have left him vulnerable to Saul, capturing him and killing him. For David, there was only possibilities. It was possible for him to make either decision, to stay or to go. And it was possible that if he made one decision, something good would happen. If you made the other decision, there was something good or bad that could happen in either situation, right? But for God, even though there were only two possible decisions that David could have made, he was absolutely certain what would happen in both instances. He knew for absolute certain that if David stayed, he would be handed over by the townspeople of Keilah, to Saul. And he knew for absolute certain that if he left, he would be safe. Not only that, God knew what decision David was going to make. He knew for absolute certainty what decision David was going to make. He even knew what decision David was going to make based on the information that he was going to give him. God knew that if he did not say anything to David, David was going to stay in Keilah, hoping to be safe. But what would actually happen is that the people would hand him over to Saul. God knew that if he told David to leave, that he would leave and he would be safe. For David, it was only possibilities. For God, it was absolute certainties. If God had not intervened and warned David that he would indeed be handed over to Saul by the people of Keilah, David would have stayed and he would have been handed over. God knows every possible world that could have existed in the past, every possible timeline that could have existed in the past, and he knows every possible world, every timeline that could possibly exist in the future. That is his omniscience. He knows everything. Not only does he know everything, but he is in control of everything. That is his sovereignty. Again, God is maximally great in every respect. And so what that means is he must be maximally sovereign. Meaning that he must be in absolute control of all of human history. However, there's a debate, right? There's a debate about whether that means that he must actively cause everything to happen, meaning that we don't have free will, that everything that we do, God causes us to do. Or if he is able, in his sovereignty, to allow certain things to happen without him actively causing them to occur, meaning that we do have free will. We do have some say in the decisions that we make. Is God still in complete control of human history if he allows people to have free will? If people have control over their own decisions, that would mean that God does not have ultimate control, right? But let me give you a couple Bible verses that seemingly say one thing or the other. One leads you to believe that God does actively control everything. Another verse kind of suggests that he allows people to make decisions, their own decisions, without causing them to make the decisions. He's maintaining passive control, if you will. The first is Proverbs 19:21. It says, "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. That would lead you to believe that no matter what you want to do, no matter what's in your heart, you can only do what God wants you to do. This verse leads you to believe you don't have free will. That it's only what God causes to happen that happens. But, on the other hand, James 4:14 and 15 says this. Well, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. We've talked about that. We have limited omniscience about tomorrow. And what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. You're insignificant compared to God. You think that your decisions matter? Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. That leads you to believe that you do have some say in the matter. Maybe God's will supersedes your will, but he still allows you to make the decision ultimately. But to be honest, kind of depending on where you land, you can interpret both of those one way or the other. Neither one definitively says whether God actively controls everything or he allows some decisions to be made based on our free will. But there seems to be some tension between God's omniscience and his sovereignty. If God is maximally great in every respect, that must mean that he's maximally omniscient. He must know the maximum amount of knowledge, and that he is maximally sovereign. He must be maximally in control of everything. And so for God to have maximum sovereignty, he must cause everything to happen. For him to have the maximum amount of control over human history, he must be the one calling every single shot. He must be the one making every single decision. And so for God to be maximally sovereign, we cannot have free will. However, for him to have maximum omniscience, for him to have the maximum amount of knowledge, the greatest amount of knowledge possible, he must have knowledge of actions that he is not causing. If he can know the actions of free will beings before they actually make those decisions, it is greater for him to have that knowledge than it is for him to have knowledge of his own actions. Does that make sense? So there's this tension. How can he have maximum sovereignty and maximum omniscience at the same time? Maximum sovereignty would lead us to believe that we do not have free will. Maximum omniscience would lead us to believe that we do have free will. And so there is this tension. And the answer to one or the other is that he must limit himself in one way or the other. But which attribute of his does he voluntarily limit so that he can allow human history to play out the way it does? The answer is in his goodness. The third aspect of his nature. God is not only maximally omniscient, maximally sovereign, he is also maximally good. That means everything that he does is good. Everything that he does is right. He is morally superior than everything else. He always does the right thing. He never does anything wrong. He never does anything bad. Therefore, he's unable to do anything bad. Therefore, he is unable to cause anyone to do anything bad. At creation, God created a world where sin was possible. He didn't create a world where sin existed. He only created a world where the possibility of sin to exist existed. He created sin as a possibility. And in the moment of creation, after he created everything, in that moment, he knew for absolute certain that the fall would happen. That Adam and Eve would sin, and sin would enter into the world. He knew at the moment of creation that sin would exist. And so, in that moment, he made the decision to direct the course of human history so that his Son would enter into the world at just the right, perfect time and die for the sins of mankind. We know without a doubt that there are things that God actively causes. He caused his Son to come into this world as the man Jesus Christ. He caused miracles. He gave prophets prophecies. He actively brought about punishment for those who disobeyed him. There are things that he actively caused. But because of his goodness, we also know that there are certain things that he cannot do. He cannot cause anyone to sin. He can only allow them to. And so in order to create a world where sin was possible, he had to give people free will. The existence of sin in this world tells us that God created this world with free will. But why? Why did he create this world where sin was a possibility? Why did he give us free will to choose to obey him or choose to reject him? The answer is love. True love cannot exist apart from free will. Now, let me give you an example of how this might play out. Imagine a young man. He walks into a bar and he sees a young lady sitting at the bar. He thinks she's attractive. He can allow her to decide for herself whether she wants to leave with him, whether she wants to date him, whether they want to go out on a date or something like that. Or he can take away her free will. He can slip something into her drink, and he can force her to leave with him against her will. Which of those circumstances involve love? If he goes up and he flirts with her, charms her, and he might swoon her enough to get her to make the decision to possibly fall in love with her, to freely or fall in love with him. She has the freedom to decide whether she's going to love him or not. But if he takes away her free will, she's not going to leave with him because of love. Love cannot exist with free will. In order for God to create a world where love exists, where people could love him, they could love one another, he had to create a world where people had the ability to choose to love him or choose to reject him, to sin or to obey. And so God freely limited his sovereignty over creation by giving us free will. He gave us the ability to partially determine the course of human history. Therefore, he did not predetermine all of human history from the beginning. Even though God knows everything that we will choose and every decision that we have to make, he does not cause us to make those decisions. He did not predetermine those decisions. And it's kind of like if you know the outcome of a UK football game. You haven't watched the game, maybe you didn't catch the game yesterday, maybe you recorded it on your DVR, but you knew after the game was over that they won, right? They didn't win, right? And then you go back and watch it. You know the outcome of the game, but you're not causing them to win just because you know the outcome. And so whenever you're in this situation, right, even if you don't know whether UK is going to win or not, you want them to win, unless they're playing you a bell, right? But to finish up this morning, let me circle back to his knowledge of the future and apply it to free will. Particularly the decision of whether to become a Christian or not, because that's where the debate lies. Does God make us choose him or make us reject him, or does he give us the ability to freely choose? If all people have free will, they have the ability to decide whether they want to become Christians or not, whether they want to put their faith in Jesus or not. He does cause some people to choose him, or he does not cause some people to choose him and repent, and others to reject him. He gives them free will to choose on their own. If he were to force this decision on some people and not others, he's taking love out of the equation. People who do choose him are not truly choosing him out of love. If he makes the decision for them, it's out of compulsion. On the flip side of that, those that he forces to reject him, he's actively causing them to disobey him and sin. And so he must allow us to choose. But in his foreknowledge, his ability to know every possible outcome in every possible situation, from the moment of creation, he knew who would choose him and who would reject him. He knew every possible timeline that could possibly exist based on every free will decision that would ever be made. He knew every possible timeline that could possibly exist based on his own intervention in the world. If he were to intervene in human history, for instance, and cause one thing to happen over the other, he would know the timelines that would create. And because he has this knowledge of every possible contingency, He works all things together for the good of those who love him. That's what it says in Romans 8. He intervenes within human history, just like he did with David. He intervenes in the course of human history in such a way as to maintain free will, but to create the best possible outcome for the most amount of people to be saved. And he set this in motion in the moment of creation. Paul explained it this way at Ephesians chapter 1, starting in verse 4. He chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. If you read just that verse, it would seem that God did predestine certain people to be saved. But then in verse 5, he clarified what he meant. In love, he predestined us to be adopted as his sons through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. He did not predestine certain people to be saved. He predestined that those who chose him would be adopted through Jesus Christ. He predestined that through Jesus we would be holy and blameless. He predestined from the creation of the world for us to be saved through Jesus Christ. The plan of salvation was the plan that he set in motion from the moment of creation. Even before the fall, he knew that the timeline of history would play out in such a way that his son Jesus Christ would enter into this world to save people from their sins on the cross. He further clarified this at verse 11. It says, in him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. Predestined according to the plan. The plan of salvation was what was predestined. And again in 2 Thessalonians 2:13, Paul wrote this, but we ought always to thank God for you, brothers loved by the Lord, because from the beginning God chose you to be saved through the sanctifying work of the Spirit and through belief in the truth. God didn't choose you to be saved. He chose you to be saved through the sanctifying work of the Spirit and through belief in the truth. Again, it was the plan of salvation that was predestined from the beginning. We are not predestined to be saved. We are predestined to be saved through the sanctifying work of the Spirit and through belief in the truth. At the beginning of creation, God determined that those who put their faith in his Son Jesus Christ would be saved. He did not determine who would put their faith in his Son Jesus Christ or not. Does that make sense? Romans 8:29 and 30, he kind of further explained this. He said, for those God foreknew, those that he knew from the beginning would choose him, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of a son. What was predestined? For them to be conformed to the likeness of a son. And those that is his omniscience. He knew who would believe in Jesus. He predestined that they would be sanctified in the Spirit. And then in verse 30, those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. Those he predestined to be sanctified in the Spirit, he called them to service. In service to the kingdom. Those he called to serve his kingdom are the ones who are justified by the blood of Christ, and those who will be glorified in this coming kingdom. God's predestination included the plan of salvation. How justification would happen, how sanctification would happen, how glorification would happen. He predestined this plan from the beginning. He also predestined the service of those who would enter into his kingdom. The plan was predestined, and our service in his kingdom is predestined. Who would be in the kingdom was not predestined. At Ephesians 2:10, Paul talked about the service that was predestined. And he said, this is Ephesians 2:10, for we are God's workmanship. That means that we're being sanctified in the Spirit. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. He predestined how we would be saved and what we would do after we were saved. But He did not predestine us to be saved or not, because He gave us free will. And so, to answer the question, did God predetermine all of human history? No. He did not predetermine all of it. He predetermined some of human history, but He also gave us free will to determine some of human history also. The decisions that we make, the actions that we do, the thoughts that we have every day, are partially determined by what God has done, but because of free will, they're also partially determined by our own free will choices. Each and every one of you are here this morning partially because of what God predetermined, partially because of the free will choices of other people, and partially because of your own free will choices. All of these things God orchestrated. Some of these things He caused, other things He allowed. But He orchestrated every event in your life so that you would be here on this morning to hear this message. And maybe for some of you, He did it so that you would make the most important decision of your life. To put your hope and trust in His Son, Jesus Christ. Well, we're going to move into a time of decision. And any time during this next song, if you have a decision to make that God has orchestrated for you to make, you are at this crossroads where God is saying, if you choose this way, this is what's going to happen. If you choose this way, this is what's going to happen. God has brought you here in this moment to make a decision. And if you want to make a decision to put your faith and trust in Him, I invite you to come forward this morning. Let's pray. God, You are so great. You are so big and magnificent. It is so difficult for us to understand who You are, how You exist, how You operate. It is so difficult for us to comprehend You. But I thank You so much for Your Word that puts it in a way that we can somewhat understand, that we can partially gain a grasp on. And I just pray that You would continue to help us to gain a better understanding of You, better understanding of Your nature, how You interact with this world, and how great Your love is for us. It would be so easy for You to just discard us and disregard us, because compared to You, we are nothing. But You did not do that. You cared enough to come into this world and do something about the situation that we were in because of sin. And we thank You so much for doing that, for loving us enough to send Your Son into this world to die for us. For those here today, for those out in the community, for our co-workers and neighbors that don't know You, that don't know what You have done for them, that haven't put their faith and trust in Your Son Jesus, I pray that everything that we do can help to lead them to You. I pray that the free will choices that we make can impact their life, their timeline, that it would cause them to put their faith in You. I pray that You would help us to do that. Put us in places where we have the opportunity to influence other people and their lives and their decisions to put their faith in You. It's in Your name I pray. Amen. Would you please stand as we sing?